Good afternoon. I'm Paul Develaire and a proud citizen of the Métis Nation from Penetanguishene. This is the Métis Voyageur Development Fund's report to the annual General Assembly of the Métis Nation of Ontario. First, I'd like to reintroduce MVDF. Now in our 9th year of operation, MVDF is a developmental lender, and unlike a bank, that means we seek to maximize profits or return to ourselves or the Métis Nation, but rather we're seeking to maximize wealth and income for Métis citizen entrepreneurs. We do that in a couple of ways. First, we provide significantly more financing towards business startup or acquisition and expansion than a bank would consider. And secondly, we do so at a much lower cost of borrowing than a bank could offer. We also provide initial ongoing support, whether that be advice towards the cost of acquiring or professional items that you may need, or we can provide financing of up to $1.5 million to Métis businesses. Obviously, last year was dominated by the effects of COVID-19 pandemic and the consequent impact on Métis businesses. Generally, businesses' revenues declined, but they still needed to pay their costs that are fixed, such as loan payments, rent, salaries, and wages. This put a strain on the cash that could threaten their business survival. And several sectors of the Métis economy were particularly affected. Métis are heavily invested in tourism and lodge operations, which saw a dramatic decline in revenue, while retail and food services were also heavily impacted. So at MVDF, our priority was to support Métis businesses by improving their financial support, whether that was by extending additional financing to cover their costs or to lower or eliminate debt payments. Our regular lending saw a steep decline as entrepreneurs shelved projects because of the effects of the pandemic, and the pandemic also had an effect on MVDF's long-term sustainability, and we took significant steps to bolster our long-term health. So as far as our response to COVID, from February through December, MVDF suspended all interest charges and payments on our loans to Métis citizens. That was over $700,000. We then worked with various partners to secure funds to offer further support with NACA, the federal government, and the Métis Capital Corporations. We secured funds to provide emergency lending of up to $60,000 to Métis-owned businesses, of which only $40,000 was repayable. The lending was at 0% and no payments during the first year. We then worked with First Nations Aboriginal institutions in the government of Ontario to provide another program to provide further emergency lending of $50,000. Only half of this was repayable, so $25,000, and $25,000 was a grant. Again, there was zero interest, no payments for the first year, and 5 years to pay the $25,000 back. Lastly, we looked at other Métis capital corporations and the Métis homeland and the government of Canada to provide support to micro businesses. These are businesses doing more under $40,000 a year. These are family-based businesses. It could be guiding, it could be trapping, it could be beading, it could be art, and we provided grants of up to $8,000 to support those businesses. We also made significant investment in Infinity Investments, the Métis Nation's community-owned enterprise. So were the results of this programming we were able to arrange. We provided over 6.3 million in emergency financing to over 200 Métis businesses. Altogether, with the interest in payment deferral, that was 7 million in cash support to Métis businesses. We changed our financing mix. We prioritized grants over loans to avoid loading Métis entrepreneurs with too much debt. So grants increased from 12% of our financing to 38%. In total, we helped sustain 880 jobs in Métis businesses throughout the pandemic. And over 98% of Métis businesses supported by MVDF remain in business despite the effects of the pandemic. And while regular lending continued, it was at a decreased level as projects were deferred or delayed. Despite this, our total financing increased by 20% from 7.2 million in the prior year to 8.67 million in fiscal year 2021. This was a record year in terms of financing for MVDF. The pandemic also had an impact on MVDF and our long-term future. So to bolster our sustainability, we negotiated support of 2.7 million from various levels of government. And by maintaining a tight control on expenditures, we achieved an excess of revenue over expenses of almost $3 million before grant expenditures. We have added $1.5 million to our reserve for bad debts. And despite all the challenges posed by COVID, our net assets grew 8 million or 31% in the fiscal year. We continue to make significant investments in Métis businesses. As you can see, we've been on a path of upward growth. Our loan portfolio continues to increase. It's now over 22 million, which is more than double since 2016, 2017. And from our startup of 2012, we're now the largest Aboriginal financial institution in Ontario, and we are substantially the largest of the Métis capital corporations across the homeland. However, this pace of growth is unlikely to continue, as our main agreement with Ontario and the Métis Nation of Ontario has expired. The results that we've got have been examined by third parties. M&O and Government of Ontario committed to review our operations in our 4th and 9th years in 2016 and 2020. These reviews were managed by M&O and Ontario, not MVDF, and were undertaken by performance management firms selected by M&O and Ontario. 6 years ago, they found that MVDF financial affairs were being consistently well managed. And last year they found, by any measure, MVDF is an exceptionally well managed organization. We think we've made a material difference to Métis businesses during the pandemic, increasing their opportunities to survive. And we've also made significant difference in MVDF's ability to survive long term. Last year was a record year in terms of financing, and we look forward to financing returning to more normal forms of activity as the pandemic hopefully expires. Thank you very much for your attention.